Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating historical thesis by Randall S. Wells, Jr. called Tearing the Guts Out of the Wehrmacht. We're going to take a hard look at the Russo-German War of World War II, specifically the Eastern Front. You know, for decades, the story of how the German Wehrmacht lost to the Soviet Red Army has been totally dominated by a very specific narrative. But today, we're unpacking the actual data and research from this thesis to uncover the real reasons the German military suffered such a catastrophic defeat. So let's just jump right into a massive historical question. Did the Russian winter really defeat the German army? If you've picked up a standard history book, you've almost certainly heard what military historians call the three alibis for Germany's defeat. Basically, they go like this. Number 1, Hitler's constant meddling in military affairs. Number 2, the brutal, freezing Russian weather. And number 3, just endless, mindless hordes of Soviet troops that overwhelm them by sheer numbers. But as our source material reveals, this is largely a complete myth. To figure out exactly where this myth actually came from, we have to look at the post-war memoirs of surviving German generals. Take General Heinz Guderian, for example. He famously claimed he never even saw the infamous Commissar Order, the order directing the execution of Soviet political officers. Well, the research points out that after the war, these generals had a huge dual motive. They were desperately trying to exonerate themselves from the horrendous war crimes committed on the Eastern Front by blaming literally everything on Hitler. And at the same time, they wanted to explain away their humiliating defeat by blaming the weather and Soviet numbers, rather than just admitting they were outfought. When we actually contrast that popular myth with the historical reality laid out in the thesis, we see that the Wehrmacht wasn't just some helpless victim of circumstance. The hard data shows the Soviet Union won the war through a really profound tactical revolution, the deployment of superior armor, and a fiercely aggressive martial ethos. It's not just a story of Germany losing, it's that the Red Army actively won.
Section 1. The origin of the myth. Let's look at exactly how these self-serving German alibis became accepted history. Well, we have to look at the U.S. Army's historical division to see how this incredible historiographical picture was built. During the early days of the Cold War, the U.S. Army was absolutely desperate to learn about Soviet fighting tactics. So what did they do? They recruited former German officers, like General Franz Halder, to write historical reports. Halder put together a control group of these former officers, and they were given a frankly shocking amount of influence over these reports. Unsurprisingly, they deliberately omitted anything unsavory or incriminating about their own atrocities. They essentially whitewashed their entire record and passed this incredibly biased information directly over to the West. And the sheer scale of that influence was staggering. By 1954, over 1,760 of these deeply biased essays, written by former Wehrmacht generals, were sitting on the War Department's required reading list for U.S. Army officers. These documents fundamentally shaped American defense doctrine, and they really helped romanticize the German military in popular culture. They pushed this pervasive narrative that the German army was a flawless modern juggernaut that only ever lost because the other side had unfair advantages.
Section 2. The real reasons. Military doctrine. Now let's get into the actual battlefield tactics that turned the tide of the war. You see, the Red Army's eventual success was actually born out of some deeply profound military theory. Back in World War I, warfare was entirely static. Men dug into trenches because machine guns made open movement virtually impossible. But during the 1920s and 30s, forward-thinking Soviet theorists like Triandafilov and Isserson realized they desperately needed to return mobility to the battlefield using mechanized vehicles. Sadly, Stalin's paranoid purges in 1937 wiped out so many of these brilliant military minds, which was just a massive setback for the Red Army. Because of that, it wasn't until after the totally disastrous start of the 1941 German invasion that the Soviets finally and fully implemented these interwar theories. And that brings us to deep battle. This doctrine was a huge departure from World War I linear combat. It emphasized using tanks, aviation, and mobile artillery to strike simultaneously across the enemy's entire defensive depth. So the goal wasn't just to punch a hole in the front line, it was to completely shatter their rear operations and prevent any enemy reserves from even deploying. But it definitely took time for the Soviets to effectively use this doctrine. To really wrap your head around the scale of their eventual turnaround, consider this staggering number. 665,000. That is the number of Soviet troops captured by the Germans in a single engagement at Kiev early in the invasion. The initial German blitzkrieg just decimated Soviet forces, who were heavily hampered by poor leadership and Stalin's early paralysis. But honestly, this massive early loss makes the Red Army's eventual tactical turnaround through the successful use of deep battle absolutely incredible.
Section 3. The real reasons. weapons and ethos. Because to execute deep battle, the Soviets needed both the right tools and the right mindset.
And one of those absolutely essential tools was mobile artillery. Triandafilov had heavily emphasized the need for it, and the Soviets delivered with the BM-13 Katyusha multiple rocket launcher. Thanks to the American Lend-Lease Act, the Soviets were able to mount these launchers straight onto US-made Studebaker trucks, so they could drive right up to the front line, unleash 16 simultaneous rockets in a devastating saturation attack, and then just drive away before the Germans even had time to respond. The terrifying howling sound those rockets made actually earned it the nickname Stalin's organ from completely terrified German troops.
Beyond just artillery, the Soviets really optimized their infantry tactics, particularly when it came to snipers. The German command, completely overconfident from their early fast-moving blitzkrieg successes, didn't even formalize a sniper training course until late 1943. The Soviets, on the other hand, they had been running dedicated sniper schools since 1927. This highly organized Soviet sniper corps systematically targeted German officers, which completely disrupted their command structure and left frontline German troops feeling, well, entirely helpless.
Which brings us to just a truly remarkable example of the Soviet martial ethos. Take Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko. She was a 24-year-old university history student when Germany invaded. She immediately enlisted, having already completed paramilitary sniper training before the war even started. She went on to achieve 309 confirmed kills, making her the most successful female sniper in history. Her story is just a perfect illustration of how the Soviet Union effectively mobilized its entire population. They brought a ferocious, unwavering dedication to defending their homeland, a dedication that the Germans totally and fatally underestimated.
Section 4. The reality of the numbers. Okay, let's dismantle the biggest myth of them all, the idea of the endless Russian horde.
When we actually examine the hard numbers for Operation Typhoon, which was the massive German push to capture Moscow in October 1941, a completely different picture emerges. The popular myth tells us that the Germans were just drowning in a sea of Soviet soldiers. But the actual troop numbers show that Germany committed over 1.9 million men to this operation, while the defending Soviets only had about 1.25 million. So the reality is, the Germans possessed a very significant numerical advantage in manpower on the ground.
And it gets even crazier. Not only did the Germans have more men during the drive for Moscow, but they also possessed a 2-to-1 advantage in armor. 2-to-1! This data completely shatters that post-war German alibi that they were merely swamped by numerical superiority. The hard numbers unequivocally prove that the Wehrmacht was the numerically superior force during this highly critical phase of the war.
So if they weren't beaten by numbers, why did the German push actually stall? Well, as the source outlines, it was a massive operational failure. The German High Command just assumed victory would take a few weeks, so they never even bothered to issue winter clothing to their troops. They basically treated a massive continental invasion like a 50-yard dash, completely overextending their supply lines across the vast Russian steppe. But most importantly, they just fatally underestimated the fanatic resilience of the Soviet soldier and the immense depth of the Soviet reserves.
Now, we do have to acknowledge that initially the German war machine was terrifyingly efficient. In the very first year of the war, the casualty ratio was nearly 4-to-1 in favor of Germany. They inflicted truly unimaginable losses. But the real takeaway here is that despite this horrific early slaughter, the Soviet state didn't collapse like Hitler predicted it would. Instead, they absorbed the blow, they learned, and they rapidly adapted.
The Soviet recovery actually followed a very distinct path. Step 1 was really just surviving that initial blitz. Step 2 involved Stalin finally taking a step back and restructuring his military command based on actual combat merit, which elevated brilliant tacticians like General Zhukov. And Step 3 was launching those deep battle tactics we talked about. They initiated simultaneous, layered counteroffensives that caught the completely overextended Germans off guard, starting with the massive counterattack right outside Moscow in December 1941.
And here is the absolute ultimate proof of Soviet tactical superiority. By 1944, the Red Army was fully on the offensive, constantly pushing the Germans back. Now, in standard military theory, the defending army usually holds a significant advantage. Yet, despite the Germans being on the defense, the capture ratio heavily favored the advancing Soviets. The Red Army was executing their deep battle operations with such incredible efficiency that they were outmaneuvering and capturing defending German units at an astonishing rate.
Which brings us right to our final thought. When we look at how the realities of superior Soviet doctrine, equipment, and sheer martial ethos were intentionally erased by defeated German generals writing their own history, we really have to ask ourselves,
how much of our accepted history is actually just the self-serving alibis of the defeated? It's a pretty powerful reminder to always question the narrative and look at the actual data. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you think you know.